This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. This interview was originally conducted in May of 1972. The interview was conducted by Mr. Pendleton Woods. The interviewee is a Mr. Howard Cannon, that's Cannon, of Bartlesville, Oklahoma. This material is being re-recorded on the 16th of June, 1986, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends in May 1972 in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. We're visiting with Mr. Charles Cannon. What? Howard, I'm sorry. Mr. Howard Cannon, I'm sorry. Mr. Howard Cannon, that's Cannon, is that correct? In Bartlesville. And Mr. Cannon has experienced many things in Bartlesville, and his wife was the late Nellie Johnstone, after whom the Discovery oil well of Oklahoma was named after. We'll talk about that, and we'll also talk about other experiences with Mr. Cannon. Mr. Cannon, to begin with, why don't you give us your family background, who your father and mother were, and how they came to the territory, if they came here, or how you got here? Well, let's tell about them, and then we'll talk about you.
Well, my father was John Cannon, Toronto, Kansas, where I was born. He was in the banking business there for a good many years, and he came from Illinois in 1880. Lived in Toronto for the balance of his life. He died in 1933. My mother was Kitty Whiteside, and she was born in southeastern Kansas, and she and my father were married at Toronto. I don't know the exact date of their marriage, but it was about 1880.
How did you come to Oklahoma? How did you?
My first vision of Bartlesville was in 1905. I drove a team down here from Toronto. My mother, brother, and sister came along. We just came down to visit some relatives. It took us 3 days to drive this team and camping wagon to Bartlesville. Then we went out in the Osage fishing and camping. We were here for just a few weeks, then returned to Toronto. I came to Oklahoma in 1909, June the 1st, expecting to be here only for the summer vacation, and I was to go back to school. But by the time of the summer vacation, I had developed typhoid fever, so I didn't make it back to school. I was enrolled at the College of Emporia, at Emporia, Kansas.
How was the area you first remember it? Bartlesville in 1905. What was it like?
Yeah, Bartlesville in 1905 didn't cover too much territory. The southern extremity of the city was at 11th Street, where there's a jog in the streets at that time. There's a little curve and the eastern extremity was at Shawnee, and east of that was in Cornfield. South of 11th Street, as I mentioned, was pasture, and a few oil wells started.
Speaking of oil, let's talk a little bit about the oil here, as you observed and may have had a part, but also as you know it from your history and your family history. The Discovery Well.
The Discovery Well was finished in April 1897. 1897, as I recall, and it produced there were about 12 wells on it at one time, and it produced considerable oil. This property was all of this area around Bartlesville was Indian land purchased by the Delaware Indians from the Cherokee Nation, and they were moved in here in 67 from Kansas City, the last of the Delawares. Chief Jernicake was in charge of the Indian delegation, and he was the last chief of the last elected chief of the Delawares. My wife happened to be a great-granddaughter of the chief Jernicake. There were numerous Delawares here at that time, and Chief Jernicake was quite a remarkable individual. He had 5 places where he preached. One of them was right south of Bartlesville, called Silver Lake, and others were around in the area, which he served by going horseback from one place to another. He was a very remarkable gentleman. Help me.
We're talking now about the
Chief Jernicake.
Yes.
Chief Jernicake and his wife, Socia, lived east of Nowata, and the exact location was called on Lightning Creek. The chief had numerous projects going in his farming, and was quite prominent in that area. He was an ordained Baptist minister, and was looked upon by all of his acquaintances as being a very, very wonderful gentleman. What else do you want to talk about?
Well, let's talk about
the chief and his wife had had 8 daughters and 4 boys. None of the boys reached maturity, but 7 of the 7 daughters were grew up and were married and lived around Nowara. Mrs. E.B. Lawson from Tulsa was one of the most prominent members of his family, and she was very active in women's clubs. At one time was national president of the women's clubs.
Let's talk about the Nellie Johnstone. The wells, the discovery, and the wells that were there and all that.
The well, which is called Nellie Johnstone number 1, was drilled in 1897, and produced oil for a good many years. It was the first well, but it wasn't long until there were derricks all over the town site. After the wells were drilled, they generally just left the derrick stand, which is considerable different from the present procedure.
It was named after your wife. Was she there at the time that it?
At the time the well was drilled, my wife was about 7 years old, and Mr. William Johnstone, her father, had the surface rights on this particular piece of land from the landowners. That was the custom. The Indians couldn't sell their lands, but they could rent them out. And he rented this particular piece of land, along with some others, from the Indian Agency. Then, after allotment time came, he filed on the allotment. He filed on this particular tract of 80 acres for his 7-year-old daughter. And she owned it until 1916. The city of Bartlesville wanted to buy that portion of the 80-acre tract, which is situated east of the Katy Railroad right-of-way. So my wife sold it to the city with the restriction that the minerals would remain in her name.
Did they start producing much out of it after it was first discovered? Was there that much demand for oil, or was it ever idle?
The oil, there was quite a little demand for it, but the price was only about 35 cents a barrel. So it wouldn't encourage too much operation or development, except that the expense of operation and development was nominal considered in comparison to what it is today. It was just a very short time until there were wells all over the town of Bartlesville. One or two instances that still operate, as I understand.
How much did the Nellie Johnstone produce in its lifetime?
I've heard it estimated a number of times. Some of these folks said that it had produced 100,000 barrels, but I don't know where they got their figures. wife didn't keep any accurate account of the number of barrels.
That's what it produced.
Yeah.
What are some of the other exciting things that happened during the early period for you? During the period, say from 1905 and between then and World War I, what are some of the exciting things that happened that you recall?
Well, I don't know. There are lots of things happened that we couldn't recall right now. But when the town began to develop, I remember one of their slogans was 25,000 in 1912. That was the slogan of the Chamber of Commerce that year. They didn't quite make that much, but it has grown steadily since that time.
How big is Bartlesville now? How large is Bartlesville now?
And the present population of Bartlesville is around 30,000, I understand.
Oil was pushing it up about 1912, though.
Yes, the oil development was quite active here for a number of years. On the original production. Then of later years, they worked on a project they called the water flood, which increased the production very materially. And it is still making quite considerable amount of oil throughout the county.
Back in those early days, who were some of the personalities that you remember that were particular?
Well, Mr. William Johnstone, who was my wife's father, was one of the prime movers in the city, and Mr. George B. Keeler, who's the grandfather of William Keeler, the present chairman of the board of the Phillips Petroleum Company. Then in 1904, the Phillips brothers came down from Creston, Iowa, and opened a bank called the Citizens Bank and Trust Company in Bartlesville, and they grew. The first national bank in Bartlesville was Mr. Keeler was one of the directors of that and one of the prime movers of that, and Mr. Johnstone was connected with the Bartlesville National Bank. Then the Phillips brothers put in the third bank, which was called the Citizens Bank and Trust Company. They operated in connection with their banking. The Phillips brothers, as well as almost everyone else in town, was interested in production of oil, and they started in with Frank, who was president of the bank. Nellie, his brother, was cashier, and they had another brother, Waite, who was their field superintendent for the oil company, for the oil interest. And I remember Nellie, as we called him, said to me one day, Howard, Brother Frank and I are figuring on putting some of these leases together and organizing a little oil company. This, of course, was developed into the Phillips Petroleum Company, and that was the start of that company. The story goes that their brother Waite, who was their field superintendent, wanted the two brothers to let him have an interest in the leases, which they refused to do. So he quit and went to Okmulgee and started by himself, and was soon rated as one of the big brothers himself. He did lots for Tulsa and other places around, and other areas around, but Frank and Nellie continued to headquarter in Bartlesville. There were 5 of the Phillips brothers altogether. Frank, Ellie, Fred, Ed, and forgotten what the other one's name was, but there's one other one. Anything else that you think of?
Oh, well, let's see. Can you think of any memorable events that took place in Bartlesville that you think ought to be recorded?
Well, one of the biggest attractions they ever had around here was when Joe Bartle started the roundup. And
Tell about that.
Joe Bartle started the roundup in 1908. His father was an ex-captain in the Army, and had conceived the idea of calling his old comrades in and spending a week and do it. And in figuring out something to do to entertain them, someone suggested that they put on a little rodeo of steer roping and calf roping and bronc busting, which they did. And Joe took it in hand and developed a real show, a big show out of it. That was one of the biggest things that ever happened for Dewey and Bartlesville both, because it helped both towns. When they started to develop the county fair, at that time the state had passed a resolution to pay for the prizes if the different towns would furnish a place to hold a roundup. So committee was called together to decide where they could put it and so forth. And Joe, as was custom, didn't do much talking, but after the rest of them had done a lot of talking and hadn't developed anything, Joe says, "Well, I'll tell you, just put that over at Dewey, and my mother and I will give you the land, and the city of Dewey will build the exhibition buildings and the racetrack, and that's what happened, and that's how the roundup happened to be in Dewey, and the fairgrounds, the county fair, Washington County Fair."
You recall any specific memorable rodeo or roundup that they had? Or anything?
Yes. One, the largest, of course, the papers carried big glowing reports of how many people were there at the different roundups. But to my certain knowledge, after having counted the money for the gate receipts, it showed about 14,000 people. And the paper had reported that there were 20, but it happened to be my chore to count the money for them, and that's what the money amounted to.
Kind of like those barrels of oil that stretch over the
Yeah,
years, huh?
that's right.
Can you, what other events have you played a role in Bartlesville? What other?
Oh, I haven't had much of a role. I first started in down here working in a hardware and furniture store. Then there was a vacancy in the bank over at Dewey. The assistant cashier died suddenly, and they gave me the job of taking his place. That was 1912, and I stayed there with the bank in Dewey until 1920, when Jess Overlease and I started a bank in Bartlesville, which was operated until 1930. At which time the Big Depression came into full force, so we voluntarily closed the bank.
We're still visiting with Mr. Howard Cannon, concluding that. I think we're just about to a close, unless you do. Can you think of anything else that we ought to?
I might tell you about some of my robber friends.
Let's tell about those. Okay.
Mr. Johnstone told me this story about a contact he had with Henry Starr. One Sunday night, someone called to him from the place where he lived up on 9th and Cherokee, and Mr. Johnstone went out to see who it was, and it was Henry Starr. And Henry says, "Billy, we're camped up here on Butler Creek, and we're out of grub. What do you do out?" Mr. Johnstone says, "Well, you stay right here, Henry, and I'll get some." So he got on his own horse, went down to a store, which was on the bank of the river, and took a gunny sack full of groceries up and gave them to Henry, and Henry thanked him and left. And Mr. Johnstone's remark to me was that he would a lot rather do that than to have them break into the store. I've personally seen Henry a number of times. He dropped in at the bank at different times in Dewey when I was there by myself, but he never did show any signs of wanting to hold anybody up at that time. He had some relatives there in Dewey by the name of Doherty. Mrs. Doherty, I think, was his aunt, and he used to come to Dewey quite often. Even when they were looking for him, when the law was after him. But he went the route of a good many outlaws, made one too many trips. It was over in Harrison, Arkansas, that he started to hold up a bank, and the president of the bank, who was sitting in the back room, saw what was going on, and he kept a squirrel rifle handy, and he just ended the career of this particular outlaw. Then there's another fellow who lived up in the country north of Dewey named Lige Higgins, who used to come into the bank, and we'd loan him a little money once in a while. But he was a reformed bank robber and couldn't keep out of the business, so he was picked off robbing a bank out in Colorado.
Remember his name? What was his?
Lige Higgins.
Lige Higgins. What about Belle Starr? Was she her relation to Henry Starr?
No.
There's no relation?
No.
At all.
Henry Starr was quite a character in a lot of
Lige Higgins. What about Belle Starr? Was she her relation to Henry Starr?
No.
There's no relation?
No.
At all.
Henry Starr was quite a character in a lot of ways. A rancher friend of mine told me how Henry got started. They were having a picnic down at Silver Lake, and Henry was driving over in a buckboard, and passed a fellow who was horseback, carrying a suitcase. This fellow on the horse asked if he was going to the picnic down at Silver Lake, and he said yes. And so he says, could I put my suitcase in your buggy? And the fellow agreed, that's all right. Well, at that time, the federal officers were watching the whiskey business pretty close, and they examined every suitcase, I guess. Anyhow, they found some whiskey in this suitcase that belonged to the fellow who was riding the horse. So the officers picked Henry up, and took him to Nowater and put him in jail. And he broke out of jail, and then after he got outside, he didn't have any money, so he went down to the depot and held up the agent to get a little money to get out of town on. And that's how Henry got started, so I've been told. The party who told me about it was a very substantial, reliable person, so I know it must have been the truth.
Do you think of any of the other bad men?
Well, they had a train robbery out on the Katy Railroad between here and Okeesa. Several local fellows were in the deal, and they had a terrible time trying to locate who they were. Everybody out in that area seemed to know what was going on, but you couldn't get them to talk. So finally one day there's an old couple and an old broken down Ford came through there, supposedly going out west, and broke down right in the town of Okeesa. And this old fella got acquainted with some of the local boys, and finally got their confidence, and they got to drinking together, and he met up with a number of the other fellows over there. He must have stayed about a month down there waiting for repairs for his car, and finally he got all the information he wanted, I guess, because he got up and left, and within just a few days the federal officers picked up the whole bunch that were in the deal. And one of them was a fellow that was killed in a Kansas City massacre out at the Union Station, if you remember that. A fellow named Frank Nash. I knew Frank Nash. He'd been in the bank a number of times when I was down here. And they had if you remember, they pulled up, they were parked right across from the Union Station, and they were meeting a fellow there, and there were there were 6 men in the bunch, but the officers cracked down on them and killed all of them but one. It was Frank Nash was the one they were after, but they shot right into the car, and they got all the rest of them except one.
Think of anything else?
Oh, I don't know if there's anything else I think of just now. I may have told you too much already.
Well, this has been an interview in Bartlesville, Oklahoma in May 1972 with Mr. Howard Cannon.